Hi everybody, I'm Professor Rad, and today we're going to talk about 3 different ways to find a sample. So for these examples of sampling techniques, we're going to be looking at the same sort of scenario for each one so that we can see, if we were asking this question, some different ways that we could answer it. So in this example, we're going to suppose that a paint company has a branch in San Diego and another one in Boston, and they want to know if people on the West Coast paint their homes a different color than those on the East Coast. All right, so that makes sense. We want to see maybe should I be stocking, different colors on the West Coast than I should on the East Coast based on how people paint their houses. Ultimately, we are going to look at 6 different techniques, but I'm going to split this into 2 videos. The first way are going to be non-random techniques, and then the second way is going to be random techniques. So for this first technique of sampling, it's going to be called a sample of convenience. Okay, so like it sounds, a sample of convenience is a convenient sample to take. So convenience just means it's easy. You don't have to do a whole lot of work ahead of time to figure out how to find the sample. So in the example of how the paint company could do this, it says the manager of each branch at the paint company asks 10 employees in their branch who live on different streets to write down the colors of 8 houses on their street. Okay. So I'd say maybe some key phrases here is we're just asking employees to write down the colors on their streets, right? So these employees don't have to do a lot of work. The manager doesn't have to do a lot of work. It's just look out your window and tell me the colors of the houses. Right? So easy, convenient to do. So, as is often the case, sometimes the things that are easiest are not always the best things to do. So, for example, here, if I'm employed at a paint company, that doesn't necessarily mean that I live in the particular city that I'm employed at. So, yeah, and these days somebody could be working remotely, so you don't even have to live in the same state where you're working. So this might create problems with that representation in the sample that we talked about in the last video. So there are a couple times when a sample of convenience is okay to use, but it is not a great strategy. So it's okay to use this technique when the population and sample are not likely to differ in substantial ways. And you can use this method if you're doing something called like a proof of concept. Before you do a bigger and more in-depth study. So I got this phrase proof of concept from Mythbusters TV show on a few years ago. And what they would do, they often did these studies that involved like explosives and large vehicles. And before you invest a lot of money into explosions, into exploding large vehicles, you want to make sure that like it's worthwhile to do this test. So they would do kind of a scaled down version, which is going to have flaws in it, but it can at least show you, does it merit a bigger study? So in this case, I'd say maybe a sample of convenience would be okay for this company to do to see whether or not they should invest in a broader study. So, hey, why don't you guys look at the houses on your street? And if they all are kind of the same on the East and the West, then maybe I don't really need to do too big of a study. But if I notice there might be some important differences, maybe I should investigate into a bigger study. So this can kind of be like, a canary in the coal mine situation. Now, another type of sample that you'll frequently see is called a voluntary response sample. And a voluntary response sample happens when the participants are allowed to self-select. So just in comparison, In this previous example, this was not voluntary response because the houses, those were the participants, those were the things we're looking at. So the houses didn't get to choose whether or not they were, studied. The researcher, the manager, or their employees are the one who chose them. In a voluntary response sample, the houses would get to choose, which doesn't make sense because houses don't get to choose that way. So let's look at a way where we could do a voluntary response sample. So it says, reaching out through their Facebook and Twitter pages, the paint company invites their followers to vote for their favorite house color on their website, as well as for Team San Diego or Team Boston. One follower who belongs to the team that gets the most votes is going to win a free home makeover. Hooray! So a clue here is that we are inviting their followers to vote. So they're inviting the people online whether or not they want to answer the survey. So there are quite a few problems with this particular example. For instance, it doesn't say where the followers have to be from. So for example, if I'm in Indiana, I could respond to this poll, but that has nothing to do with the house colors on the East Coast or West Coast. Or more specifically, San Diego or Boston. And I don't even have to live in San Diego or Boston to vote for that particular team. So maybe I live in Boston, but I vote for Team San Diego. I don't know why I would do that, but maybe I would. So there's some suspiciousness going on with this. This is really not that great of a sample to pick for this case. So a comment about voluntary response samples is those who self-select tend to have strong opinions, right? So in this particular case, I'm not going to vote here unless I care about house colors, right? And not only do they have strong opinions, they're also more likely to have negative opinions. So maybe I want to vote in this survey because I don't like the color of my house, and so I have a negative opinion about that. So as a result, the sampling technique is never acceptable to use. You should never use a voluntary response sample because your data is always going to be unreliable. So for example, another one that you might see is maybe there is, somebody wants to know whether or not the food on campus is good, right? So they ask people to respond to a poll online about whether or not you like the campus food. And people who love the campus food are going to respond and say they love the campus food. People who hate the campus food are really going to respond, even more so than those who love the food, right? Because if you're thinking, well, I hate this food, but so I got to be heard so that, they change it, you're more likely to respond. The people who are kind of in the middle, who are just like, it's not the best, it's not the worst, it's all right. They're less likely to respond because they don't feel like they can contribute much often because you're just kind of in the middle. So it doesn't really matter to you to respond, and so you're not likely to do that. So when I first learned about voluntary response samples, that got me to thinking about how we have elections in the US. That's this question I have to think about. How is a voluntary response sample related to voting, and what are the ramifications of that? So we just saw that in a voluntary response sample, people choose whether or not to respond. And when you vote, that's what you're doing. You choose whether or not to vote. We don't have compulsory voting. In other countries, if you don't vote, you have to pay a fine. In the US, that doesn't happen, right? You can choose to vote or not to vote, which means elections in the US are voluntary response samples, which means the results are not going to be reliable. In other words, the representatives that we're voting in to represent us don't necessarily represent the will of the population. because you're more likely to hear from people who have strong opinions. So think about far left or far right. And you're likely to hear from people who have negative opinions. So people who are unhappy with the status quo and want things to change. So the people who come out to vote are more likely to be dissatisfied, and therefore their opinion is likely to be heard more loudly. The people who are kind of in the middle of the road on politics, or the people who don't feel strongly one way or another, are less likely to vote. And the people who are, content with the way things are also less likely to vote because they don't feel that strong push, whereas those who are really excited or really unhappy with things are more likely to vote. So you don't necessarily have to write anything here, but if you want to write some thoughts there, you could pause the video, kind of summarize what we just said. But think about that if, you're interested in politics and how else we might be able to get a more representative government. The third type of sample that I'm going to talk about here is called a systematic sample. So a systematic sample is selected by first putting the population into some kind of order, and then you pick a number, maybe 10, and you choose every whatever numbereth person. So you might choose every 10th person on the list. So maybe in a factory, I pick every 5th tire that comes off of, the manufacturing belt. Or if I'm at a restaurant, I pick every 3rd receipt that came in. If I'm looking to survey people, perhaps I put people in alphabetical order and I pick every 8th person on the list. So there's some kind of order, whether that's like the order they come out of the manufacturing process, the order they come into the restaurant, an alphabetical order. There's some order on your population. And then you don't look at everybody, but you pick kind of a frequency. So it's systematic because it's kind of like a machine system where it just sort of churns out, every 5 seconds something happens. So every nth person, you're looking at them. So let's see how we can identify that from this example. It says, this time the paint company pulls a list of all residential addresses in San Diego and Boston. Then they record the color of every 10th house on the list. So you have the 10th house, the 20th house, the 30th, and so on. So that every 10th, that is our clue that this is a systematic sample. Now, an important note here, there's a difference between sort of like casual English speak and specific statistics speak. So this sample, the systematic sample, appears to be random, but it is not a random sample. It might seem kind of random in the way that like, oh, that's so random. That's more like casual English speak. In statistics, random has a very specific meaning to it. And in particular, in randomness, you try to avoid something that might cause like an order or a specific pattern, perhaps. So for example, in the systematic sample, not everything is likely to be selected. You're selected on like every specific interval. So kind of a really mathy example, for instance, if I wanted to pick if I wanted to pick a systematic sample of numbers, maybe I pick every other number. So I start picking 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. This is not a random sample because the odd numbers are not as likely to be selected as the even numbers are to be selected. There's sort of a bias towards the even when you select every other number. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about random samples, what that actually means, what that looks like, and why that's perhaps a little bit better than the 3 samples we talked about today. The 3 samples we talked about today, the reason we talked about them is because you see them very frequently. They are, all of them, easy to do and relatively inexpensive. So because of that, they tend to be used often, but we can see that there are some issues with this sampling technique. So I'm looking forward to seeing you for random samples in the next video. In the meantime, have an excellent day.